Welcome back to Serious Talk Agentic AI, the show for business leaders and technical teams navigating real-world agentic AI. I'm Greg Banks, and today I'm joined again by Gavin Franklin. Today we're tackling a topic that sounds simple until it becomes a real risk, multi-tenancy. And we're going to contrast it with multi-user because they're not the same thing. If you're building or buying agents that touch real company data, this is one of those get it right early decisions that can save you from security issues, compliance headaches, and unexpected costs later. Let's dive right in. Welcome back to Salesforce Agentic AI. No Tim today, just me and Gavin. Gavin, welcome back.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for having me back. Excited to be here.
All right. Cool topic today. One that honestly I had to do a little research to come prepared to speak with you on, but we're going to talk about multi-tenancy today. And rather than just putting that on an island and assuming it matters to everybody, we want to kind of do this in a means of contrasting multi-tenancy to multi-user. They are not the same thing, and we'll get into why today. But why don't you start by kind of defining what those two things are and maybe a use case. So if a business leader's listening right now and they go, does this matter?
Yeah.
Help this topic resonate.
I would put each agent into three separate tiers. So the first tier is individual user. This is typically where you're going to see like an ambient agent, one that runs in the background. Users don't necessarily interact with it. And it can just behave like an admin and perform whatever tasks you need to do in the background. And then you get to your multi-user, which is essentially where you have multiple users interacting with the same agent, and you want to enforce some sort of security between the users, or maybe even just access in general. Maybe it's not necessarily security focused, but I want the agent, when I interact with the agent, to only have access to documents I have access to on my Google Drive would be a really good example of this. So anytime you're working with contextual data and the individual users are engaging, you want to start thinking multi-user. How do I design my agent to handle the multi-user use case? And then the third tier, which is even the larger, definitely in the realms of security, is the multi-tenant agent. And that's where you have a few different possibilities. So either maybe you have one AI agent working with multiple companies, multiple branches of your companies. Maybe there's some laws or regulations around one portion of your company not being able to actually see data from another portion of your company. I've seen this a lot with PE firms and various other clients that we've had. So that's where you want to start thinking multi-tenant, and that security and the scrutiny you have to apply to that AI agent becomes a little bit more severe.
And it's probably fair to say that a company of size has faced a problem like this before, right? When you do integrations, I would run into this. Maybe I need some things logged. So I've got a salesperson who's doing an activity and I want to log that activity, but where I'm logging it, they don't have access. So that integration runs with a higher authority than the actual person that's triggering the agent to fire off. So that'd be a good example of that, I would suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's get into some definitions before we go too far into this today, Gavin. There's it's not just that everything's changing, but new words keep coming up, right? So I just want to start with some basic terms that we're going to get into today. Let's kind of define at a high level what those are, and then you can speak obviously more to it as you start breaking down the comparison between the two. Let's start with memory. What exactly is memory when in context of talking about agents?
Yeah, so memory can really be defined as a few different things, but the way that I like to look at memory when it comes to agents is its ability to persist historical interactions. So there's tons of different contexts you can give to your agent. But with memory, it's really, if I'm interacting with the agent, how does it know what I asked yesterday? So when you think about multi-user versus multi-tenant memory, in a multi-user memory, you want to say, hey, only remember the interactions that Gavin had with you. And so your memory needs to be divided in whatever system you're storing it in per user based off of some user ID. And it could be anything, whether it be user email or some sort of unique ID generated by the system. You just need to make sure that from a security perspective, whatever user is interacting doesn't have the ability to change who they're authenticating as, right? So that's where you want to see memory isolation per user. On the multi-tenant level, it gets a little bit more scrutinous. So I think before I jump into that, one thing to note is multi-tenant doesn't necessarily imply multi-user. So you could have an agent work with separate tenants, but maybe they don't actually dive down at the user level between those tenants. So with the multi-tenant side of the house, when you're talking about memory, this is when it's not, hey, a tenant's API key, right, can access both of the both of the memories of either tenant. That's the important piece here. So you need a separate level of removal. So one API key from one access should not be able to access the secondary tenant's memory. That's where things get really important here. So when I think about this from an implementation perspective, I would probably look to store it in a different instance of a database or completely isolated from a security perspective when it comes to user memory or agent memory.
Yeah, great point. If you've ever been involved in any kind of legal discovery, if you want to go back and follow the breadcrumb trail where somebody's been, context matters, right? So if I've got 4 tenants and this particular user that's being discovered for any legal reasons only should have been accessing one, then I shouldn't have to look in the other 3. But you want to make sure that anything that had gone on is relevant to the place they should have had access to and it doesn't cross over. So good point. Embeddings or vector search? Define those for us and then compare and contrast.
Yeah, so that's where we get into documents, right? So we just talked about agent context in terms of memory, but what about accessing your files? So with files, AI really interacts in 2 different ways. In order to search the files, AI has to first work on the files to make it searchable, right? So when you get into embeddings, that's when it's essentially looking at your current database and trying to figure out where each little piece of this document lies on a map that the AI is creating, right? So it's basically creating a network of, really it's points at the end of the day, but the AI is interpreting it as concepts. This piece of your document falls in line with this concept of your business. That way, when somebody in the future does a search, the AI will look at what you're asking for and then look for that concept within your documentation and pull it up. So when you think about embeddings and really document storage and retrieval for multi-tenancy, you really have to separate it in both places. You can't have the embedding portion, the starting portion where your documents are first put into AI context, have access to all of the tenant's documents, because then it can really manipulate and change the way it does its original embedding and can expose some of your data even. And then on the second side, you have to be worried about the retrieval, which is the vectored search, which is where AI takes that input that the user is giving, tries to figure out what documents are relevant for that conversation. So you have to be secure there as well, to be protective over the fact that you don't want that vectored search to have access to the other tenants' embeddings in the database. With multi-user, very similar in nature. However, most of the time with multi-user, you're more worried about just making sure that the user only has access to the documents they have access to. So there's a couple different ways of doing that, right? So there's 2 different concepts. The first one is what the AI has access to, and that's typically things like training documents. That's in multi-tenancy where you want to separate those out. And then the user side of the house, you want to be thinking about what documents are they storing in their Google Drive. I don't want this person to have access to the Google documents. And maybe those documents aren't even ones that you're embedding or vectorizing that the AI needs to have access to perform its job. But you want to be able to pull up as reference if somebody asks a question like, give me information on this project's charter that was just signed, right? You want to restrict the actual access they have in those systems where the documents are stored.
Fair enough. And there's a couple of reasons for that. One, obviously, one, safety, right? You want to honor this. We talked about security last week. Like these things, these matter important as a company, whether it be intellectual property, trade secrets, any of those kinds of things that you want to guard. But the other thing's performance, right? If you just let the agent run anywhere it wants, every time it wants, that's definitely going to degrade the response time of your agent when it's trying to get results, right? So a lot of reasons to look at this. All right, the last one, logs and traces. So this one's probably my favorite, maybe because we just talk about security so much. Also because I've been involved when legal showed up and we had to look into those things that my users had done or maybe had done and whatnot. And you just want to have good evidence. So I would think when it comes to having an agent fire, it's really, really important that you trace those details and you do it in a way that the things you trace are useful. But there's a boundary around that you want to establish. So I'm not going to try and do the technical definition there, but this is a really good one for people to think about.
Yeah, no, logging is really interesting in the AI world, right? When you move into a place where the AI is almost determining your logging, you do put yourself at a little bit of risk, right? Because you still want your logs to be confined to what data you want to store. So PII, any information like that, especially if you're developing an agent that interacts with the user, you're exposing yourself to the trust that the user doesn't interact with the agent, exposing that data through that interaction, like a chat bot. They may actually type in one of your client's PII information in there, right? So when it comes to logging at the multi-user level, the first thing you want to look at is make sure you're logging by that user ID. That way, as an admin, you can go in there and say, this is how the user interacted with my agent. Additionally, I would always start in both multi-user and multi-tenancy. At first, the lowest level logs outside of the AI's control, and then work your way up from there. So what I mean from that is log the interactions. Log that this user interacted at this time. Maybe they used X amount of tokens. Then you might start to look at, can I log the input, the user input? That can be dangerous. What if the user says something you don't want to log? Then you might be able to start looking at, have the agent start logging the interactions themselves, which can also be very risky. Same thing with memory, right? Memory is the same way. Memory is essentially logging for the AI agent. So those are the things you have to be really careful about when it comes to storage. And that if you were a company that works with a lot of PII, I would look to implement some sort of scrubbing agent that takes those inputs, scrubs PII out of there before you do any sort of memory or logging. And then when you get into multi-tenancy, really important that you're not only, organizing those logs by user, but you're organizing those logs by tenant. And then just like with memory, just like with documents, one tenant their API key within the agent should not have access to the other tenant's logs. Logging is a little unique. Perhaps you have an admin over both branches within your company. At that point, you might say, okay, we're okay with dumping all into this logging system because we only have admins within that logging system. So just things you might need to ask and keep in mind when it comes to logging and building out agents, especially in, I don't want this sales team to be able to see this sales team's logs or interactions with their agent.
Yeah, and you mentioned private equity earlier, the org I used to manage. We had 9 companies in one Salesforce org. I'm just using Salesforce as an example. But we had situations where the FTC requirement was that they couldn't see one another, interact one another. And you got to be creative in creating some of those walls sometimes to make sure those things are not possible. As an admin, right, there's different rules to that game, but for your user population, that really, really matters. Good deal. So the components we look at in breaking this out: memory, we talked about documents, logging, and tools and credentials. Let me throw a question out at you. If an OAuth token, right? OAuth is a key that's laid on top of things to have one component access another part of the system. If it can access 2 different customers, are you multi-tenant?
Definitely not multi-tenant at that point. And this is something that, and I think it goes a little bit deeper than that, right? Again, we're in the world of AI. If I was just writing code and I gave it an API token, I would feel very secure in the fact that that code's going to use that API token to retrieve whatever that API token can access. The problem you run into is if your LLM is exposed to an API token, then it could potentially try to get as much data from that database as possible. And there is going to be, if you're in multi-tenancy, some shared window, some small shared window of that setup. And your LLM can absolutely expose that. So I would highly recommend that with multi-tenancy, it's far more important that you're leveraging things like MCP services, not handing the API keys to your LLMs, but handing the API keys to your MCP services, where the code can take it and you can run with the confidence that we have been for years with API keys.
Yeah, my brain, when it comes to the memory conversation, I always think about the clipboard in your computer. We had policies at my last company where if you ever left your desk, you had to lock the computer out. You couldn't leave it unlocked because somebody could walk up and see what you have. What you don't realize is the last thing they copied. So you could open up Word and hit paste, and anything they've copied now is becoming visible. If you think about memory, inevitably that's what's going on. Is it's storing it somewhere. You don't have to know where that is. Just know that it's there. People with evil intent are going to look to seek out some of those things.
And just to kind of reiterate too, because this is going to be a complicated thing for a lot of companies. You just talked about Salesforce, for instance, having a scenario where you had multiple companies you can't talk to each other. So when you have a LLM and you've separated your companies out in Salesforce, it still needs an API key into Salesforce. Right. So that's where you have to be really smart about where you put your API keys, who has access to them. because even if you have it separated out in Salesforce, you're really exposing yourself to the LLM using some creative measures to get the data that the user is requesting, because the LLM doesn't want to fail the end user. We've seen this time and time again. Anytime you're communicating with an AI, it's going to try whatever it can, especially with these more powerful models. It's going to retry sometimes and maybe try different API in routes that you don't want it to. That's why you have to leverage MCP services.
Yeah. And for the business leaders out there, what does this mean? It may mean more money, right? It would be easy if I've got 50 employees, I'm just going to give them all a master key. That I don't have to track 27 different keys, one for each office, and figure all that out. Just give them all masters. That never works out in your favor, right? And by the way, master keys are more expensive. So what that might mean in this world is you may have to have more than one API key, or you may have to pay for more than one user license, because to the extent you've got separation, you have to maintain that separation in how agents interact with those data repositories, right?
Yep. And it actually, I would say it increases your reliability on things like in Salesforce, as an example, like field level security, right? You're probably going to be creating some sort of AI admin profile, but you really need to be careful about what all you give it access to in the system, even more so than before, because now it's a user that can use APIs whenever it wants to. You got to be really careful with it.
I'm having gremlin flashbacks. Like, you just don't want this little animal running around.
Exactly.
Doing wonderful stuff, right?
Treat it like a gremlin.
There you go. They're never looking out for your best interests. If somebody were to invite you in to say, hey, we've got this environment set up, and we've set up this multi-tenant environment, what are some things you would look for to kind of prove out that they've done that right, or perhaps they've left the back door open?
Yeah, I would look at really the three categories we just discussed first. So do we have complete separation of documents? Do we have complete separation of user memories? For logging, do you need separation of logging? What information are we logging? And if you do need separation of logging, again, do you have it? Do you have those API keys that are separate? The next thing I would look at is exactly what I would look at for security in general. Are your LLMs being exposed to API keys, or are you handling that correctly? Do you have good security policies with with your regular systems? Are your security policies in place? All of that is going to be a big multi-tenancy problem for sure.
Yeah. So you didn't directly say this, but as you're answering, my mind's going back to the topic we had in the security conversation. If an agent were to say, hey, can you send me over the API key? It's going to go try and find that thing and send it to somebody via email. Dumb questions are the most prevalent thing you need to be thinking about. What is something somebody could do, even unintentionally? But you need to know their security policy before you could determine, are they playing by all the rules right here, right?
Yeah. Then you've got two gremlins.
Then you got two gremlins, and they're not necessarily on the same team.
Exactly.
I love this term. What does a good tenant offboarding process look like?
Yeah. So, I think your offboarding process is going to be mirrored pretty closely to what you see with a user offboarding process, with a little bit more steps. So with a user, you're looking at shutting down access to all of their systems, right? So if your agent is user split as it is appropriate, right? If it's done correctly, then just simply removing access to something like Google Drive means that agent and that user ID no longer have access to Google Drive, right? So you just have to treat your agent from a user perspective as another way for a user to interact with your business data. So of course you want to shut off their access to that agent, but you also want to shut off access to, as you do today, any of those external systems that it might be connected to. With the tenant, it gets a little bit more complex. You want to do everything that we just discussed, but you also want to start removing some of those training documents. You want to start removing some of the logs potentially, or isolating some of those logs. You want to dig into those user memories and start offloading those into a different database as well. So pretty much anything that a tenant might have access to within that AI agent, those are things you want to look to get out of your system. So it's not just shut off system access, it's start purging data or isolating data into a separate system.
You've mentioned 2 or 3 times in this episode about PII, and that term hopefully resonates with most people in an American audience. But I was involved with a European company before coming here, and it very much overseas. They're ahead of us in dealing with some privacy law. GDPR, probably one of the biggest ones. And I would just encourage companies that are looking at this, Be extremely cautious. You don't really know when you've got a European person coming at you, and you've got to, if you have any potential for European clientele, you have to respect GDPR, even if you're an American company. And the teeth that they have in the EU to go after somebody who violates GDPR are extremely expensive. It's insane. So just you don't have a chance to go back and redo the past. So you really need to have these hard conversations and analysis on the front side to make sure you keep up. All right, pop quiz, Gavin. Rapid true-false statements, just to kind of walk away with some tangibles here. Multi-user means different organizations share the same AI system, but with different permissions.
Let's say false. That's multi-tenancy.
Trick you. In a multi-tenant AI system, tenants should have different data pools with no overlap.
Absolutely. It's a definition of multi-tenancy, I would say.
Multi-tenant means everything is separate, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you store documents separately per tenant, you don't need to enforce permissions during retrieval.
I would say that is false. That is the core concept of document retrieval multi-tenancy. You need to enforce permissions both at retrieval and at embedding.
Good deal. Embeddings in vector search are part of the data boundary and can cause cross-tenant leaks if not tenant-scoped.
Absolutely. Yep. Something that we discussed there. You want to be able to create that boundary between tenants both at the searching and the embedding. So when the document hits the pipeline and when you try to retrieve it with the agent.
Using a single shared OAuth token for multiple customers is acceptable as long as the UI filters out the results by tenant.
I would say false. You do not want to leverage the UI to filter out results. It can expose you to a ton of data security issues. Anybody worth their salt in the computer science world could definitely just look at the packages that are being returned. Don't use UI for filtering sensitive data in general.
Yeah. Painful lessons learned there, right?
Yeah.
Last one. Logs and traces can contain sensitive tenant data, so they need tenant-scoped access controls too.
Absolutely. 100% tenant-scoped access controls. And I would even go as far as to say you really need to have some good boundaries on what it is you're logging, right? In order to justify or protect that sensitive data being stored. Starts at that side, but 100% in a multi-tenancy situation needs to be isolated.
Great. Gavin, this is I'm going to say it's not the easiest topic. The problem is no matter what we put in these, somebody's going to have a scenario that we didn't directly speak at. So if questions arise following this, feel free to reach out to us at serious@serioussolutions.com. We'd love to hear some follow-up, some more topics you want to hear in light of this. We know security and some of these things are very deep topics and contexts, even of discussing them actually matters. So please feel free to reach out to us. Gavin, thanks for your time today. Thanks for, again, breaking this thing down where just about anybody's going to be able to understand it. We thank you for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Have a good one. Well, that wraps today's episode of Serious Talk. Thanks again for listening, and a big thank you to Gavin Franklin for helping break down multi-user versus multi-tenant agents in a way that's practical for both business and technical teams. If this episode's helped, here's your call to action. Share it with a business leader or a delivery team that's struggling to implement agentic AI safely, especially anyone dealing with multiple business units, customers, or regulated data. And if you haven't yet, follow or subscribe to Serious Talk so you don't miss what's next. And leave us a review. It helps more teams find the show. You'll always find links and resources in the show notes with recommended content related to today's episode. If you've got any questions or you want to weigh in on a specific topic, such as multi-tenancy, reach out anytime at serioustalk@serioussolutions.com. The address will be in the show notes as well. And a special thank you to Jason Fowler for allowing use of his song, Mystery Road. Until next time, I'm Greg Banks. Thanks for coming along.